Hey everyone, welcome to LSAT Wizard's video explanations. This is going to be an explanation video for parallel questions, some of the most notorious questions on the logical reasoning section. Now, this video is an extension of our free logical reasoning and reading comprehension curriculum. Uh, if you haven't already checked out the rest of the course, I strongly encourage you to do so. A lot of the strategies, techniques, concepts that relate to these questions that will make you better on these questions are things we've already gone over. Having said that, we will get into the parallel questions here and do a free example. Now, this entire thing is part of a COVID relief effort, not just because I'm offering free and low cost instruction during these tough times, but also because we have a GoFundMe where we are raising funds for Feeding America to help those most in need during these times. Now, I want to say a special thank you to everybody who's already given. We've already crossed the $10,000 mark, which is truly insane. So thank you everyone who's already given. If you find these videos at all helpful and have the ability to, I kindly ask you to consider giving to our GoFundMe. And so I want to thank you in advance for that. Finally, I need to give a special thank you to our sponsors, Ave Maria School of Law, who came together with me at the start of this pandemic and throughout the pandemic to continue trying to offer more and more in giving back. And none of this would have been possible without their help. So thank you to Ave Maria Law. Now, with that, we're going to get into the parallel questions here. Now, the parallel questions are going to be part of lesson 4 of the curriculum and in the outlines. If you haven't already checked out any of these, besides my YouTube channel, which you could look up the LSAT Wizard YouTube channel, you also can go to lsatwizard.com, go to the video courses and find the free content or sign up for one of our low-cost subscriptions to get even more questions unlocked and explanations unlocked. Now, these outlines are available on the website. So if you do want to get that outline, go check it out. It's lesson 4 is where we discuss the parallel questions. Specifically, we're going to jump ahead to page 10, I think is at the bottom. Yep, parallel. Now, in getting into the explanation of what a parallel is, this is a very specific type of question that I always like to give a little bit of thorough explanation with. Now, what they're asking for is a logically similar pattern of reasoning. If we are looking at the question stems for a second, they'll say like, which of the following most closely parallels, which of the following, or the reasoning above most closely parallels, which of the following, or which of the following is most similar in its pattern of reasoning. So they're talking about this similarity in pattern of reasoning. Now, the idea is that we need to make sure we understand the rules, as with so much of this test. We need to make sure we understand the rules of what counts as a parallel. Now, I am going to say this up front. There is a different question type called a flawed parallel. If you are struggling on those or looking for a video on those, find the different video for flawed parallel because these are different, okay? We will attack flawed parallel very different than we attack parallel. When I say very different, there's obviously overlap, and I will explain the difference in the flawed parallel one, but this video is purely for the traditional parallel where it doesn't explicitly mention a flaw. Now, in terms of what the rules are for matching a parallel, okay, there are 3 rules that we have to follow for the correct answer to be correct. I like to differentiate it versus 2 rules that never have to be the issue, okay? So for this, I'm going to do an example verbally, okay? So just imagine for a second that the stimulus of a paragraph says, anyone who jumps in a pool will get wet, and anyone who gets wet will need a towel. Brandon just jumped in a pool, therefore he's going to need a towel. Okay, we have to be able to follow that argument. Anyone who jumps in a pool will get wet. Anyone who gets wet is going to need a towel. Brandon just jumped in the pool, therefore he's going to need a towel. Now, one of the most important things to recognize about that stimulus is that it is a conditional style argument. It is going to involve our if-then ideology. Now, most parallel, it's about 80 to 90% of all parallel questions will deal with conditionality. When you have conditionality, there's even going to be a little bit of a shortcut that we can do to make it even that much easier. I say easier in quotes because it really depends on how your skill is with conditionality, but we're going to be able to attack it a little more formally. And what we're going to do, regardless of conditionality or not, is we're going to try and turn that argument into a generic flow. Now, I'm already getting ahead of myself here and getting into the explanation. What I wanted to do was first start off by just highlighting something here. Okay, the idea of the parallel is first, I want you to recognize that it will never need to match in language. What I mean by that is topics are irrelevant. If you have an answer that says anyone that studies for the LSAT will do well, and anyone that does well on the LSAT will get into a good law school, Melissa studied for the LSAT, therefore she will get into a good law school, that would be a parallel to my initial example with Brandon and the pool. The idea is that they're talking about different topics, but that's okay. That's okay. In fact, we expect it to talk about different topics. Sometimes they try and tempt you by having one answer that's on the same topic, but realize topics never matter. Separately, we also want to recognize that chronological order never matters. So if my first example, again, I'll repeat it, anyone that jumps in the pool will get wet. Anyone that gets wet will need a towel. Brandon jumped in a pool, therefore he's going to need a towel. If I tried to like reverse the chronological order of that with the Melissa example in the LSAT, if I said Melissa will be getting into a good law school, and we know that because she studied, and anyone who studies will get a good grade on the LSAT, and anyone who gets a good grade on the LSAT will get into a good law school. That would be a logically consistent parallel, even though the chronological order, sentences 1, verse 2, verse 3, were a different shuffled up order. As long as we have all of the right logical components and the evidence as a whole collectively matches with the evidence of the answer and the stimulus's evidence match and the conclusion itself matches, then we're okay there. No, so those are the two things that don't matter. Now, what are the three things that do? The three things that do matter, I call number, strength, and direction. Number is the number of logical components going on. So if I have an answer choice that says anyone who studies for the LSAT will do well, Melissa studied for the LSAT, therefore she will do well. That would be wrong for number. Remember that the initial example had two conditional ideas where it was anyone who jumps in a pool will get wet, anyone who gets wet will need a towel. So if you have an answer that says anyone who studies for the LSAT will do well, Melissa studied for the LSAT, therefore she'll do well, there's only one conditional phrase there. That would make it wrong because it's not matching the number of logical components. Now, it's not about sentences, it's about logical components. So you have to make sure you're aware of those issues of phrases as opposed to sentences and making sure you have enough logical phrases for what's going on. Okay. Now, strength. Strength has to do with obviously degrees. Now, I could call this the degrees overall. Once in a while, you'll see them mess around with the other degrees besides strength. Strength has to do with that strong, semi-strong, weak. If you're not familiar with that language, you haven't watched my lesson 1 video, go back and watch that. That's my issue of probability and proportion. Call it strong, semi-strong, or weak. But the idea is we have to make sure we are aware of all degree issues. There are other degree issues as well that could come up, but just because that they're just not that common in parallel, I try to really focus on strength as that key area to match. So if we have an answer that says anyone who studies for the LSAT will do well, and anyone that does well on the LSAT is likely to get into a good law school, because we have likely as opposed to, again, my stimulus throughout this has been the pool example. My pool was a guarantee. Anyone who jumps in the pool will get wet. Anyone who gets wet will need a towel. Brandon jumps in the pool, so he will need a towel. So as soon as you get, since that initial stimulus was all strong, as soon as you get a semi-strong or a weak language, you could realize it's wrong. Okay. And something that I'm going to say now, as soon as you see anything wrong with it, it's wrong. A lot of people think parallels are some of the longest questions because size-wise, they are some of the longest questions. If you were to thoroughly read every word of every answer of every portion of this, it would be some of the longest questions. But realize that a lot of these answers can be eliminated pretty quickly because if you see literally it just, let's say the first word of an answer choice said, most people who study for the LSAT do well. Let's say the first word, most, I could already cross it out. I literally don't have to read anything else in that answer choice because it's not matching in the strength. If I recognize that the initial stimulus was all strong and an answer choice has most, that's a different strength. So you can get rid of that answer choice. So it's about matching in number, matching in strength. Now, something else with strength is it does have to match in its location. So what I mean by that is if I said anyone who jumps in a pool, I'm going to put this one here. So anyone who jumps in a pool will get wet. Most people who get wet will need a towel. Brandon jumped in a pool, therefore he is likely to need a towel. Okay. Now, First off, this is not valid. If your mind is like, wait, Brandon, that's not a valid argument. It is not. You would be correct. If you thought this was valid, it is invalid. This goes back to transitive issues from lesson one with the most and some ideas. But it's irrelevant in a parallel question as long as you recognize the general flow. This first sentence was strong, and as they're trying to make the transition, they're transitioning into a semi-strong idea. So if you have an answer choice that says most people who study for the LSAT will do well, and anyone who does well on the LSAT will get into a good law school. Melissa studied for the LSAT, thus she is likely to get into a good law school. This would not be a parallel, and it does have to do with the strength issue. In the initial stimulus, the first sentence of your transition. Now, remember, it's not about chronological order. It's about the A to B, B to C, that transition idea. And since this is like our A to B, and then it's like most B's or C's, and this one would be most A's or B, and if B then C, this makes it different logic. Okay. And beyond just recognizing like the structural pattern difference, realize this one we said was invalid. Well, this one is valid. The difference isn't just a structural thing. It actually makes the logic different in general. And that's why it matters. That's why it's not a parallel. So you have to make sure that your strength matches in the right spot. Now, direction is more of the quote unquote obvious once it's pointed out, but sometimes the most challenging to handle. And that's the direction of, let's say, conditionality, the direction of the flow from one idea to the next. All boys like football as opposed to all football fans are boys is a very different statement. And we have to make sure that they're not reversing it. If we were in this example, or let's go with the original pool one, anyone who jumps in a pool will get wet. Anyone who gets wet will need a towel. Brandon just jumped in a pool, therefore he's going to need a towel. That's the initial stimulus example. Now we have an example answer choice that says anyone who studies for the LSAT will do well. Anyone who does well on the LSAT will get into a good law school. Melissa got into a good law school, therefore we know she must have studied for the LSAT. That would be reversing it at the end there. Notice how I went from that C back to the A idea. It went from Melissa getting into a good law school, flowing back to conclude about the first idea of her studying for the LSAT. That's changing the direction, and then it would be wrong. Now, how do we handle number strength and direction? This is similar to a lot of our structure-based questions where we need to read the stimulus and understand generically what's going on. Okay, what is the conclusion? What is the evidence? Now, since over 90% can be done conditionally, with those, you can actually start creating an A and B style argument. If A, then B. So for my pool example, we could actually do if A, then B, if B, then C. So if you jump in a pool, you will get wet. If you get wet, then you're going to need a towel. Brandon jumped in a pool, therefore he's going to need a towel. We could say that would be if A, then B, if B, then C. Brandon had A or somebody had A, therefore somebody needs C. That would be the generic breakdown of that argument. And that's something that you need to be able to do when it's conditional. If it's not conditional, or if it maybe feels conditional, but you're just like not sure, then just keep it more abstract. It is challenging at times. These can actually, for a lot of people, be the most challenging question. I'll tell you, when I was a student, I used to think these were some of the toughest questions until I really formalized a pattern. I was taught this more formalized approach or whatever, and I'd go to conclusion and then backwards and then this line and that line. And technically some of those strategies that have you really break down each and every line work, but they do take time. It can be excessive. So I actually find it to be better to teach it a little more generically, only really implementing like crisp structure when it's like demanding it of you with the conditionality. Similar with the conditionality, a lot of people say, hey, should I write down the conditional? My honest belief is that you should be able to keep track of a basic conditional flow in your head. If we had that pool example, if A then B, if B then C, we have A, therefore C. If you can't keep track of that in your head, we're just not comfortable with the LSAT yet. Okay, so you're going to have to practice that if you have to write it down today, fine. But by test day, that's too basic of a concept for you to be saying to yourself, well, I need to write it down. If you need to write it down, you're just not skilled enough yet to really do well on this test. We need to be able to keep track of a basic example of A to B, B to C. There, if A, we have A, therefore C. Now, I also want to emphasize that at the same time, there are some that I write down. Okay. As much as a basic A to B, B to C is something you don't need to write down, there will be some that are really complicated. I've seen some that are like, if A, then B or C. If B, then D. If C, then E. We don't have E, then we don't have B. And if we have E, it's like, well, now you've lost me and we need to start writing it down. Okay. So if it gets complicated, yeah, write it down, but that really shouldn't be your go-to strategy. Your go-to strategy should be trying to handle it in your head. Now, if you can't put it in conditional terms, you just got to keep it generic and understand generally what the argument's trying to do from a structural perspective. So it's in that structure family. Now, to put that in action, we're going to see it here in this free example that we're using from the June 2007 LSAT. If you haven't already done this question, you can go Google, as of today, go find for free on LSAT's website, the June 2007 LSAT, Section 2, Question 12. I'm also going to pull it up on the screen. And we're going to try and do that one together. Now, I'm going to jump right to the answer. So if you need to answer this, go pause the video right now, go do it on your own, and then go into it. But we're going to break it down together. So with that, we're going to get into this explanation. So which of the following arguments is most similar in its reasoning? This is the traditional parallel question. It's a parallel. I just call it a parallel. I'm saying traditional parallel because it doesn't indicate that it's a flawed parallel. So with the regular parallel, going into this thinking, hey, maybe this is conditional, maybe it's not. I just need to make sure that I understand the argument. Now, this one actually really is not a conditional to me. It kind of is, but it's not so cookie cutter, if A, then B, if B, then C. So I didn't even bother trying to do it that way. Okay, what happens is they start with this first sentence that's saying, and so I've promised to keep a confidence, and someone asked me a question that I cannot answer truthfully without thereby breaking the promise. And it says, obviously, I cannot keep and break the same promise. So the idea being that I've made two promises. One promise is to keep a confidence, okay, and someone asks a question that you can't answer truthfully without breaking the promise. So now you're in this like catch 22 is basically what they're setting up. So either you're going to answer it truthfully and break that promise. I'm sorry, you cannot keep and break the same promise. So what's happening is you cannot, sorry, I apologize. I got some work from home noise going on in the background for a minute. So I apologize for my distraction there. But the idea is that the first one is saying that the promise is to keep a confidence, meaning keep a secret, right? And you're not going to be able to answer somebody's question truthfully without breaking the promise, to then come back to conclude that you can't simultaneously do two things. There's two things that you can't do simultaneously. You can't answer all questions truthfully. I guess I should put that in pink to color code it. And you cannot keep all promises. It's impossible to do both. If you know my games course at all, it's creating like a hater relationship between these two where you cannot have two things. Okay. So the idea is they created, if I'm thinking of this generically, they created a scenario where they said in doing one thing, it's impossible to also do something else at the same time. And therefore it's impossible to do two things together. There's this like inherent conflict that two things can't happen together. So I'm looking for an answer that creates that generically, just two things that can't happen together. So as I'm reading the correct answer A, it becomes clear it is claimed that we have an unencumbered right to say whatever we want. It's also claimed this other thing that we have an obligation to be civil to others. And they create this, but civility requires that we not always say what we want. Basically, that the second idea, the pink, will lead to us breaking the yellow. So they conclude at the end here that it cannot be true both yellow, whatever we want, and pink. So it creates that issue, okay, that we can't do both yellow and pink. And that's the issue of, hey, we got two things we cannot both do. So that's going to be the right answer. Now, in terms of going through the wrong ones, okay, one of the things that I try to do is look for the key aspects, okay? This is where I'm not always going in order. Even if I had A to B, B to C, we have A, therefore C. That might not be the first thing that I do. A lot of answers, you can even almost do like a quick skim first to even see if it generally has some notable parts. One of the notable parts of this particular question is that conclusion being, hey, we can't have two things simultaneously. So what I was doing with these answers was even just skimming, looking to see if any of these answers just have that hater style, we can't have two things together conclusion. So what they say is, since the only way for this, the conclusion here is It follows that some politicians must deceive. That's not a conclusion about two things cannot both happen. That makes that already wrong. Okay, so that would make B wrong. Now, C, if we put a lot of effort into making this good, so I'm going down here, skimming, looking for the conclusion. So whatever we do, we risk conclusion. Now, if you were, this is one that had kind of two ideas. There were like two sides, like, hey, if you go this way, then you're going to risk criticism. And if you go this other way, the opposite way, then you're also going to risk criticism. So no matter what, you're going to end up with criticism. That's different than saying there are two things that are in conflict with each other and we can't have both. This one saying that we're guaranteed to have one. That's different than saying we can't have both. Okay. And if you even just went to that conclusion and see this is, oh, we're going to have this one idea, that's just a different degree, different strength of that conclusion, different number, if you want to call it number, strength. I mean, it overlaps with both of those issues. Okay. So if we come down here and are looking for this, so is right here. Either creditors did not have legitimate business claims or businesses did not have sufficient resources. That is going to be either not one, not yellow, or not pink. I actually like this conclusion if I just was skimming. Okay, now as we continue reading, we want to start then seeing, okay, does it create a situation that actually proves that you have this conflict between yellow and pink? And we have here, if the creditors have legitimate claims about a business. Now this is creating an if then, and the business has the resources to pay for it. So if I was doing like an A and B, it would be like if A and B, then we have obligation is C. Also, if they have an obligation, so if C, then D. So this is creating a transitive flow. As I'm noticing the structure here, it's if this, I'm just going to point out the if then, where the then is business is obliged to pay it. And then it says if a business is obliged to pay debts. So this is like if something, then X, and if X, then something else. If I realize that, that's a totally different logical structure. That's transitive property. That's what we called that. That transitive property is totally different than what's going on here. We do not have transitive property in the initial stimulus. And so that allows us to eliminate answer choice D. As we read answer choice E, okay, the conclusion is we will have to keep our business hours as they stand. It's, again, not the two things in conflict with each other. That's just a different number, different degree of our conclusion. And so E would also be eliminated. So this was not the most traditional of that, like A to B, B to C example that I described with the pool, but it is one that is a little more generic. So you could see that example. If you're looking for more explanations, unfortunately, I can't do them for free outside of this test, but you can check out one of our low-cost subscriptions on LSATwizard.com to check out more. And please subscribe to the LSAT Wizard YouTube page or sign up on LSATwizard.com and stay tuned for more explanations to come.